As with any other medium, those who love and consume video games tend to follow specific creators wherever they go.
The likes of Rockstar, Naughty Dog, and Insomniac Games have all developed reputations for putting out consistent, high-quality work, and all enjoy the advantageous position of being supported by strong parent companies.
However, not every studio is as fortunate.
It's a sad reality of the industry today that video game development is fraught and occasionally torturous, but it can be made so much worse given just the wrong push from a given publisher.
The following studios were given that exact push, whether by being forced to adopt a specific engine, shift development to support a different title, or just by being liquidated entirely. One thing's for certain though, no matter their fate, they're definitely not what they used to be. So, I'm Ewan.
And I'm Josh.
And here are 10 beloved video game studios publishers ruined.
Number 10, Visceral Games. All the developers on this list were shortchanged in one form or another, but Visceral got shafted hard. The studio never seemed like a good fit for EA in the first place, who actively didn't want the kind of single-player, slightly out of the mainstream games the team was so good at delivering. The first two Dead Space releases were home runs, but then the publisher decided to stick their neck in. Wanting to transform the property into the next Call of Duty for some reason, the third game was mandated to be more action-focused, to include co-op, and be stuffed with microtransactions. When that sequel failed to sell a frankly ridiculous 5 million copies, EA put it on ice, and drafted Visceral in to make a Battlefield spin-off, the Cops and Robbers themed Hardline. It was a fine game in and of itself, but you could tell the studio didn't have much experience creating a first-person shooter. Things looked up after that though, with Amy Hennig joining the studio to begin work on a story-driven Star Wars game. Everything sounded promising, but EA cancelled the title as they moved towards live service experiences instead, killing the studio along with the game.
Number 9, High Moon Studios. One of the many casualties of Activision's cutthroat approach to video game development, High Moon Studios was effectively killed in 2013 when the publisher laid off 40 of its employees. Instead of leading development on its own games, the studio would be reassigned to lend support to Call of Duty and Destiny, a sad indictment of Activision's constant attempts to emulate the lead villain of 1997's Space Jam. High Moon's Transformers games weren't incredible, but they were great. Starting first with War for Cybertron, the studio carved out a niche of one of the best developed licensed titles of the decade, bringing the Transformers back to their 80s roots by divesting from Michael Bay's films, which were still dominant in 2010. It was everything that fans wanted and more, and it only improved with the sequel. Fall of Cybertron introduced the Dinobots and chronicled the cyberplanet's dying days. It also included an enjoyable multiplayer mode, co-op survival, and pretty much everyone's favourite Transformer, and even a remix of Stan Bush's The Touch. The game even ended with the Transformers heading to Earth, but High Moon would never get the chance to finish that story, with 2013's Deadpool their final release. It's a familiar story by now. Activision-owned studio produces several great games before being restructured and sent to do nothing except support Call of Duty. Oorah?
Number 8, Rare. Rare's fall from grace will always remain one of the industry's biggest tragedies. Back in the 1990s, the British studio was seen as a scrappy upstart, a cutting-edge team of people looking to deliver iconic characters, worlds, and experiences on consoles. The relationship they struck up with Nintendo was endlessly fascinating, as they twisted the platforming genre on its head by delivering the foul-mouthed Conker's Bad Fur Day on the family-friendly Nintendo 64. Between colourful platforming titles like that, Donkey Kong Country, and Banjo-Kazooie, as well as first-person shooters like Perfect Dark and, of course, GoldenEye 007, Rare was seemingly unstoppable, and their impending purchase from Microsoft led many to believe they'd be set up for life. And in a way, they were right. Rare have never gone away, and continue to produce games for Microsoft, but shortly after their acquisition, the charm and spark of creativity quickly faded. The first warning sign came when Bad Fur Day was ported over to the original Xbox and was censored, but that was just the tip of the iceberg yet to come. Perfect Dark Zero was a mess of an Xbox 360 exclusive, Viva Pinata left a lot to be desired, and most recently Sea of Thieves ended up disappointing Xbox One players.
Number 7, LucasArts. This might technically be cheating, given LucasArts acted as both a publisher and a developer, but there's no denying the industry landscape is worse off without it. At its peak, LucasArts is one of the most formidable forces in the gaming industry. Front and center to its successes were its Star Wars titles, which it both developed in-house and published from external studios. Seminal titles like Monkey Island and Grim Fandango came from within the walls of Lucasarts, and though the company was afflicted with a myriad of issues during its twilight, they were still creating genuinely worthwhile ideas, with Star Wars 1313 its final E3 demo. For all the good that Disney have done unto Star Wars since their acquisition of Lucasfilm in 2012, there is no arguing with how poor their handling of the Star Wars license has been when it comes to video games. They effectively gutted LucasArts to shop the Star Wars license to EA, who are yet to produce a single fully operational single-player battle station by the time our friends arrived.
Number 6. Beenox. For the longest time, Beenox were the little studio that could. Initially conceived as a porting house, the company eventually moved on to create their own original games, starting with, the B-movie game, before Activision put them in charge of Spider-Man. After a few years of disappointing open-world tie-ins, the new developers took the reins and created Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, a genuinely innovative take on the wall crawler that blended a bunch of different versions of the superhero into one story-driven extravaganza. Despite selling well and scoring high with critics, the harsh reality of licensed games quickly caught up to the studio. Activision gave them a year to craft a follow-up, Edge of Time, which wore its rushed development on its sleeve. They bounced back with the original Amazing Spider-Man tie-in, but suffered again from a lack of time and money on the sequel. Following this, Beenox were relegated to being a support studio for Call of Duty and other Activision titles, taking off their own original games. That's what they've spent the past few years doing, with their only notable game being the admittedly stellar-looking remake of Crash Team Racing. Spider-Man is, of course, in better hands now, but Beenox's talents are still being wasted.
Number 5. Raven Software. Back during the early noughties, Activision were in full control of the Marvel license. Although this did lead to the occasional dud, for the most part, the company enjoyed modest success from their Marvel games. Treyarch produced a seminal release in Spider-Man 2 and an underrated classic in Ultimate Spider-Man. But it wasn't the wallcrawler who was having all the fun. Marvel's mutants were fully in on the act too. Releasing in 2004 and 2005, the X-Men Legends series put players firmly in the shoes of the Uncanny X-Men. Raven would later expand their horizons with Marvel Ultimate Alliance and X-Men Origins Wolverine, before trying their hands at the FPS genre again in Wolfenstein and Singularity. The latter would prove to be their last full release. Shortly after Singularity released in 2010, the studio was restructured and shipped off to assist on, you guessed it, Call of Duty. In the decade since, every single project Raven has worked on has had something to do with Call of Duty. Before this, Raven developed seminal titles in Star Wars Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast, as well as its follow-up Jedi Academy. Today, however, they do nothing but COD. 1v1 me on Rust, Activision, I swear to God!
Number 4. Pandemic Studios. Yet another studio EA drove into the ground. For a time, Pandemic Studios absolutely ruled the mid-2000s with a string of beloved franchises, including the original Star Wars Battlefront, Mercenaries, and Destroy All Humans. The problem was, while all of these different properties were notable and had their fans, they weren't gigantic successes. EA are a company that likes hoovering up every nickel and dime they can get their hands on, and as a result, Pandemic were put onto new original projects to tap at much bigger audiences when they were purchased in 2008. That led to the studio's final 2 games, which were both released in 2009. Lord of the Rings Conquest was envisioned as being the next big multiplayer hit, using the Lord of the Rings name as leverage, but it was totally naff. The second release was the criminally underrated The Saboteur, but again, it failed to really capture the imagination of players. Even Titty DLC couldn't save it, and that's when you know you've completely messed up. After that, and a mere year after being bought by EA, the publisher began the process of shutting the studio down.
Number 3. Bungie. Bungie's Halo series is one of the most influential gaming franchises of all time. Really, no booming voice edit, but whatever, and was the title that launched Microsoft's foray into the medium some 18 years ago. From Halo Combat Evolved to Reach, the studio helmed hit after hit after hit, and managed to ensure that Halo will go down as one of the greatest video game series ever created. Reach, a prequel to the first Halo game, ended up being Bungie's final contribution to that series, and fans were excited to see what they had planned next. They'd signed a deal with Activision earlier in 2010, cue ominous music, but the studio wouldn't bring everyone across with them. Some would stay to assist 343 Industries on Halo 4, and Activision's reputation sort of goes without saying at this point. Bungie's next big thing was meant to be Destiny, and the hype was real. The game proved to be a massive commercial success, spawning several successful content add-ons and even a sequel in 2017. The Bungie of yesteryear, however, had ceased to be. Instead of creating a mythos as rich or as vibrant as Halo, the studio now spends their time crafting a repetitive loot shooter with an aimless story. Microtransactions are prevalent, and the grind, as they say, is real. Number 2, Hangar 13. Mafia 3 is a criminally underrated title. Yes, it wasn't without its flaws, but you struggle to find a single-player experience as authentic on the current gen. Hangar 13's command of history distinguished Mafia 3 immediately upon release, and it was clear the studio had some great ideas worth sharing. Headed up by ex-Lucasarts designer and comic book scribe Hayden Blackman, the studio looked as though it would be 2K's next big outlet. Only the story since has proven to be a bit of a bummer, at least depending on who you listen to. According to Kotaku's Jason Schreier, the years following the release of Mafia 3 have been unkind to Hangar 13. Although they've set up a new office in Brighton, many who worked on Mafia 3 left or were moved on by 2K. Several promising titles are said to have been shelved by the publisher too, including an espionage game set in Berlin, while Schreier's report also mentions how it was 2K who demanded the studio shoehorn in open world activities to Mafia 3 and refused to delay the title for polishing. There's still a chance Hangar 13 could become the studio it promised to be when it was initially founded, but judging from accounts so far, 2K have prohibited it from becoming into its own.
Number 1, BioWare. BioWare's decline is probably the most recent tragedy on this list, to the point where the wounds are still sore. The once great RPG maker arguably started to falter after botching the ending of Mass Effect 3, but it was EA's decision to make them adopt the Frostbite engine for all future games, which sealed their fate. Even on the well-received Dragon Age Inquisition, it's been documented that the engine caused the team a huge amount of pain, as they struggled to get the technology which is optimized for first-person shooter games to accommodate their vision of grand third-person role-playing titles. Across Dragon Age, Mass Effect Andromeda, and most recently Anthem, the tools have hindered the team's ambition at every step, and EA apparently haven't offered much in way of support. If anything, the publisher only punished the studio for getting to grips with the engine, as they moved BioWare staff over to help similarly struggling devs on FIFA. There's blame to be shared by the developers themselves as well, of course, but there's no denying EA's disdain for single player and their forced tech mandates forced BioWare's hand.